one of the things that this has prompted is a new round of recriminations among Democrats and a new round of demands the Democrats face up to their own culpability in Biden.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. November 5th, 2024 is a day that will go down in infamy for many Democrats. The Democratic Party has struggled to find its footing and a cohesive message after losing the White House, the House, and Senate by unexpectedly large margins. Questions immediately swirled around President Biden, his decision to run again and then to withdraw not long before the election, and whether that was a deciding factor. And just as a new book was about to launch, Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, a spokesperson for President Biden announced that he had just been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. What role did Biden's decision to first run and then withdraw from the 24 presidential race play in Democrats' sweeping losses on the day? How relevant is the information that's shared in the book? And how does Biden's cancer diagnosis shape the narrative on these issues? To discuss this, I'm joined by USSC non-resident senior fellow Bruce Wolpe and associate professor in American politics and foreign policy David Smith. Bruce worked with Democrats in Congress during President Obama's first term and was also on the staff of Prime Minister Julia Gillard. And David is jointly appointed with USSC and the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. And he has an encyclopedic knowledge of many parts of American history and, importantly, can talk about what it means for today. So Bruce and David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mari.
And at the end of the episode, we'll get your by the number stat. So I'm very keen to hear what you've chosen on this topic. I think there's a lot of numbers we can look at that might shed light on some of these dynamics. But let's just start. Let's kick off by casting our minds back to November 2024. And earlier than expected, the results were coming in and really showed a decisive victory for Republicans, including that they would likely take the House, which they did do in the end. But even that was unexpected. So what do you think were the biggest factors that contributed to Democrats' losses on Election Day?
I think the single biggest factor was the cost of living crisis that is facing a lot of Americans. I think that was reflected in the exit polls. That was reflected in a lot of the discussion that happened before the election. And I think it's reflected now in Trump's declining polls and the amount of disappointment that we're seeing about the fact that Trump has also not addressed this crisis. I think it became clear, especially in the last 2 years of the Biden presidency, that it didn't matter how well the conventional numbers on the economy were doing. It didn't matter how well Americans were doing on unemployment and GDP. Cost of living around especially rent and food was something that was just making it very hard to live in America. And if anything, the economic recovery that was happening was actually making things more difficult and more expensive because of the fact that a lot of people who would previously have been involved in low-wage, low-status jobs in things like in-home care were taking better jobs, which meant that the kinds of service jobs that are required just to keep the country going were getting more and more expensive. This was something that nobody really had an answer to, but it was something that when you look at the history of elections, both in the US and in other countries in the world, this is something the governing party always gets punished for. And you could see around the world last year, in every country where there was an election, the incumbent, if they didn't lose, they lost vote share and they lost seat share. And the United States was no exception. So I think it wasn't the only factor, but that was really the decisive factor in the election. And if Republicans aren't careful, it's going to be the decisive factor in the next two elections as well.
Hmm. And Bruce, I know that that cost of living is something we talked about ahead of the election as a big thing that was shaping the polls. But what do you think were the big factors that led to Democrats' losses on the day?
Oh, I agree with David completely. If the economy had been in good shape, I think Kamala Harris would have won. For sure, there were culture war issues that were eating away at Democratic constituencies. Younger people, well, everyone, young people, black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, and there was seepage from Biden Harris 2020. But if the economy had been good, I think actually she would have won narrowly, but she would have won. And what's really interesting, David is absolutely right. There are parallels with other countries. I really thought Albanese was going to be hit hard on cost of living here, but in listening to the labor's director of the campaign at the National Press Club in the past couple of days, he said something very interesting in it, and I think it really turned the tide for Albanese, which was they were able to deliver um, to households across the country cushions against energy prices, education prices, senior care, Medicare, medical care, and so forth. And actually, people plus a rate cut that came in, and people felt that labor had a good grip on where the economy was going. And yes, they were really hurting, but they saw that labor was trying, and that was enough to take care of that issue. I really thought that Albanese was vulnerable on it, but Dutton was a much weaker candidate than Trump was as far as the general election is concerned. So yeah, David's right. And but I think that is a really interesting comparison between our two countries.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting because then the Australian election campaign was taking place amongst the backdrop of the Trump tariffs and Liberation Day and
Yes.
having these huge economic impacts globally. And so then the fact that there was alignment, with the Liberal Party to some extent with Trump, and then how that became a liability in some ways. It was a very different to few months prior where the American election was taking place, but without that context, everyone just saw the country was in bad shape economically, and that is always a referendum on the incumbent party.
It's true. One thing on the congressional elections, the Senate was expected to go Republican. It did. I thought the House. I was wrong. I thought the Democrats would take the House, but they didn't. And then you have to look at the total votes, and Trump got 3 million more votes in 2024 than he had in 2020. And Kamala Harris was down 7 million over what Biden and Harris had in 2020. And that loss of support that goes down ballot, and that edged the Democrats out by like 5 seats after everything was said and done.
Yeah, it made a big difference. And Bruce, I remember on one of our podcasts, in the lead up to the election, but after Biden chose to withdraw from the race, you said that if the Democrats lose in November, you think the people will blame Biden. Do you think that has happened? Do you think that's where the narrative has gone after the election?
That's happening. I mean, I
Mm.
think I think Biden is he's getting getting hit really hard, but I think history will judge him very hard. I mean, if we recall, he entered the 2020. Two things on 2020. The Democrats were looking for who was the candidate that was going to beat Trump, who was most capable. Biden lost Iowa and New Hampshire, but he wins South Carolina. And the Democrats collectively were just trying to say who is the best candidate to take Trump down. And
Mm.
ultimately they landed on Biden. They thought, yeah, he'd be most capable to do it. And so he won the nomination and cleared the field. It was really pretty remarkable. When he got the nomination, he said he would be a bridge to the next generation and the future. And he reneged on that. He
Mm.
thought he was in a pretty strong position after those midterms because they were not as catastrophic for the Democrats as people were expecting. And he just sort of kept gliding along. And that proved to be a fatal mistake. He beat Donald Trump. But the fact is, he did not defeat Donald Trump because Trump came back in 2024 to win.
And then now, as in we've just been seeing more of Biden in the news recently because of the book that's launched now, which has a pretty damning take on Biden's choice to run again and what it meant for the Democratic Party. Um, I'm not sure if either of you have had a chance to read the book yet, but a lot of the information has kind of been leaked and shared online. David, can you tell us a little bit about what is some of the new news that has come out from the book? What have we learned that we didn't know before? And do you think that sheds light on what was happening behind the scenes in a different way.
So we've learnt based on the reporting that his aides were very worried about his physical decline, that if he was going to serve a second term, that it would probably be in a wheelchair. They were worried about the possibility of him having falls. They were, they were worried about his ability to work the kind of hours that are expected of the president. His working hours had been reduced and made a lot earlier. In some sense, I'm not sure how new all of this is. And I mean, the revelation about him not recognizing George Clooney at a charity event, that had actually come out at some point last year as well. I suppose one of the things that this has prompted is a new round of recriminations among Democrats and a new round of demands the Democrats face up to their own culpability in Biden, in protecting Biden, in not confronting the truth. I think it's important to recognize, though, how hard it was once Biden had made the decision to run again, how hard it then was for Democrats to do anything about that. Because last year there was a lot of talk about, shouldn't Democrats have forced Biden to stand aside earlier? In the system that they have for selecting a candidate, I think we have to appreciate it is nigh impossible to force aside an incumbent president.
Hmm.
And especially in the circumstances that Democrats were in, where for many of them, the important thing was not getting Biden reelected. The important thing was keeping Trump out. And they were in this terrible situation where Biden was not going to go unless he went voluntarily. And it looked like Biden was just not going to go voluntarily. And so they were in this position where anything that they did, anything that they could have done to try to force Biden out just would have looked like weakening Biden, just would have looked like playing into Trump's hands. So they were in this terrible strategic dilemma. And sure, they probably could have handled it better. But that dilemma is a product of the primary system.
Hmm.
And the primary system, it's got its virtues. It was introduced by the Democratic Party after the 1968 convention debacle because the previous process for selecting presidents was just not very democratic. And they wanted to get away from this elite selection process where in many cases primaries didn't matter at all. Hubert Humphrey won that nomination without facing a single primary. So that has really opened it up, made it a lot more democratic, arguably, made room for candidates like Obama, who probably would not have been the selection in 2008 if it had just been the party leaders. But there are some things, there are some defects that this system has. And one of them is when there's an incumbent president, you're very unlikely to actually get the kind of competitive primary process that you get when the office is open. And sometimes that process is it's necessary. Australians may not like the instability that often comes along with a process whereby the party room can change leaders. And, we went through that process in the 2000s and the 2010s where there were, a lot of prime ministers in a short space of time. But at the same time, that avoids the kind of opposite situation that you have where you have this president who everybody can see is just not at the top of his game. People have serious concerns about, but they worry about the damage they will do to themselves and the party if they try to remove him. So I think certainly the top Democrats do have to face their share of responsibility for this, but I just want to acknowledge the real structural difficulty that
Hmm.
Biden put them in by deciding to run again.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I just want to amplify on that. David's right. There's also an historical reason to supplement what he said, and that is Jimmy Carter,
Mm.
1980,
Yep.
facing had a country in a terrible economic mess, Arab oil embargo, inflation, high interest rates, recession setting in, and Ted Kennedy come forward and he says, "I want to redeem my brother's legacy, and I'm challenging you." for the presidency, and he did. And the result was he bitterly divided the party. Carter did win the nomination, but goes on to lose Ronald Reagan. So that's in the DNA of every living Democrat. And since most of them in the House are over 75 years old right now anyway, they remember that. But the other thing was that Biden's infirmities were not they simply were not known very well. And you did not have, no cabinet member said, I don't want to serve further with President Biden because I don't believe he's up to the job. No senior staff resigned and said, I'm sorry, you can't work with this president. There were no leaks to the press about his thing. It actually took his freezing on national television, the debate with Trump, to do it. If that freezing had occurred 2 years earlier, well, we would have had a different ball game. So, so I think all these things come together. Very hard to dislodge a sitting president, and Biden was conducting himself in terms of doing the job. I think there's a division between doing the job and communicating what you're doing about the job. In terms of doing the job, I think he was a very good president.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a couple of very interesting parallels that seem to be, illuminated in this discussion, because we've talked a lot before about, how President Trump has kind of gained so much sway over the Republican Party, where really he wasn't a traditional Republican, and now he's got such control over the Republican Party right now, and there's very little that the party, whether it's the Tea Party movement or the neoconservatives, very little that they can do to shape what Trump is doing. He's the leader of the party and he's the president, and there's almost nothing anyone can do against that. And I guess so if it's similar to what you're saying about Biden, he as the leader of the party and as the president, there's so little that the party could actually do to change who's at the top of the ticket or have him not run. That's an interesting parallel. And also the fact that we've also talked about in this, very tumultuous second Trump presidency, we've seen so little pushback from Republicans in Congress. And they are scared about a lot of things. And so they are not pushing back over a lot of things that historically Congress would not have accepted from the president doing. But they've ceded a lot of power to him. But if that's similar to the Democrats who were surrounding Biden, his cabinet and the people around him who were supporting or enabling the actions that he was doing because of that power imbalance and that dynamic. That's an interesting parallel to me.
Well, I think actually in both cases, it's the same thing motivating Republicans surrounding Trump now and Democrats who are surrounding Biden then. It's fear of Trump. Democrats were terrified of undermining Biden and so bringing Trump back. Republicans are terrified of the political consequences of crossing Trump.
Yeah, but I mean, Biden represents solid democratic values, so there was no ideological split. With Trump, it is complete fear that he will eviscerate their political lives.
Yes,
and he can carry that out. No one thought of Biden as the enforcer, and if you look at his legislative record, really quite good, and so he was there. But it comes down to, boy, when you're the president, you want to stay as president. You want to enjoy everything, enjoy the office, enjoy the tenure, the power. And he wasn't, or his family, what's clear from this book as well, his family, they didn't want to leave the White House either. So we were stuck. And history will judge his decision to contest the second term really poorly. He's going to suffer. Harry Truman, when he left the presidency, people thought, boy, you were one of the worst presidents we've seen in a long time. But he was ultimately redeemed because people reflected on what he did, tough decisions, Hiroshima and other ththings that he did at home. And so over the years, his stature has built. That will not happen with Joe Biden.
Yeah. And on that point, because I've been thinking a lot about one of the things that is a marring factor in Joe Biden's legacy, which is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So you can really trace that as the point where his decline in the polls began and where he, I think in many ways kind of lost a bit of authority. That was not some spur of the moment decision. Even though it looked like something that was incredibly sort of chaotic and last minute. I think it's worth noting that Biden, in many ways, took the blame for decades of policy failure in Afghanistan. So, by the time Biden took office, withdrawing from Afghanistan was, in fact, basically a bipartisan position. Trump had wanted to do it, but he kept getting overridden by his own generals. Biden actually did it under the auspices of a deal that Trump had done with the Taliban. And Biden had wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan as early as 2009. But in Obama's cabinet, he was the main voice advocating withdrawal. Other voices wanted the United States to remain. So nobody thought that the US should remain in Afghanistan indefinitely, with the exception of some in the Pentagon. What it turned out was that the Afghanistan government that the United States had set up was incredibly corrupt and brittle and had absolutely no stomach for dealing with the Taliban once the US was gone. That was a big sort of unexpected factor. Maybe it should have been expected, but that, once again, that's a reflection of 2 decades of policy failure. But the other thing is, where I think that Biden perhaps took more of the blame than was due to him, is this is what losing a war looks like. And the country never came to terms with the fact that withdrawing actually meant losing the war. Nobody ever explained that properly. I don't think anyone was ever really able to explain that properly. This is what happens when you lose a war. And it looked really bad, but there are some war losses that have looked a lot worse historically than that one did. So I think in many ways, Biden took the whole blame for American failure in Afghanistan. Now, I think for the reasons that Bruce mentions, that's not going to be reevaluated. Nobody's going to look back at the Afghanistan withdrawal and say, "Oh, that wasn't as bad as we thought it was." And I'm not saying that it was actually any better than it looked, but I do think that that Biden has taken a lot of the blame for what was actually 2 decades of failure.
And the other thing that hit him within a month after Afghanistan was inflation broke out. So the two together, he crossed under 50% in that July, August, September period, and he never recovered. Never.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, you have a president with that low approval. How can you? So ultimately, how can he win? And so ultimately, when he did freeze, everyone suddenly realized, oh my God, this guy has no path to victory.
Yeah. And Biden his legacy has really come into sharp focus now, because with the book coming out and then Axios released the recordings of the Robert Hur interviews. That was the special counsel that looked into Biden's handling of classified documents. And he had said some critical things about Biden at the time that a lot of Democrats came out and attacked as being, very, politically motivated and unfair. But now Axios has released those, so everyone can hear those recordings for themselves and come to their own conclusions. And then just a couple days after the recordings dropped, that's when a spokesperson for President Biden came forward and said that just on Friday, which I think is the same day the recordings dropped, he had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer with a Gleason score of 9 out of 10. It is not curable, but it is treatable. And they've said they think it could respond well to treatment. With all of this happening very fast, there was this initial wave of sympathy and well-wishing. And then quickly, 24 hours later, the Laura Loomers of the world, there was no sympathy right away. But very quickly, oh my goodness, it led to a lot of questions, largely coming from, the MAGA right, but also some questions coming from the left as well. What do you think are the biggest kind of questions that are emerging in light of this diagnosis? And do you think there's really much credibility in the sort of things people are looking at?
I think they just confirm the cancer diagnosis just confirms the fact that he shouldn't have run for a second term. Think about it. Let's say he did run. Let's say he won. Well, where would we be right now? A second term president, 82 years old, going through cancer treatments, and he has 3.5 years left in office. and that would completely degrade confidence in the president and his abilities and so forth. So I think the two narratives actually tie together. But we're
Mhm.
not doctors or anything like that, and but David and I will check our prostates, as soon as possible. But it's I think it just adds to the judgment that he really did the country a disservice and his party a disservice by staying in the race until he was forced to leave. There is one other thing that really Bob Woodward wrote a book last year called War, and it covered Biden in Ukraine and Biden in Gaza and Israel. And his my reading of that book was here was a president at the top of his game in terms of exercising the foreign policy of the United States and protecting its interests diplomatically and then on a national security front. And so that does not jive with what we're hearing about Biden and how he comported himself in this book. And that's why I think there is a division between how a president does his job and how a president talks about his job in the public. I think he fails the latter. I think he did
Mm.
fine in the former. And that's my judgment about this.
Mm.
But people, the way politics is, if you don't perform publicly well, you're dead.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, it is, Bruce said, like, performance is part of the job because the president of the United States, more so, I would say, than the prime minister of Australia, is seen as a kind of embodiment of the country. And if you look at previous presidents, they've been expected to be physically strong. That's why FDR hid the fact that he was in a wheelchair through his presidency. It is important for people that that the president embodies the country and is seen as healthy. So even if it's not Biden's fault that his health deteriorated, but that is part of the job of being president of the United States.
Hmm.
I don't think that there's anything suspicious about the timing of this announcement. I mean, I always tend towards coincidence rather than conspiracy as an explanation for things. I can see where all of the conspiracy theories come from around this. I think Biden seems to be facing this with his usual optimism. I mean, he's signed book deals. He's got creative agent representation. He is determined to tell his own story about it, and I don't know that he'll ever reclaim control of the narrative the way that he wants to. But I'm sure we'll see at least one more book out of him before this is over, telling his side of the story. And it will be very interesting to see what he says about all of this. It may be, yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is though, Trump, his base is rock solid 40% of the country. I mean, a thing to
Mm.
watch on his approval rating is if it goes below 40, like Biden's did, that means that Trump supporters are peeling off from him. But they just believe, and Trump just talks in the most denigrating terms about
Oh.
a president. And the press secretary, Ms. Levitt, I mean, she says terrible things about it, insulting things
Mm.
about him, and it's wrong, but it works for them politically, and that's why they do it. So
Mm.
even before these revelations, before the freeze and everything else, they were talking with him as if he was dead man walking. I mean, it was
Oh.
just nasty. But that
Mm.
nasty politics is what Trump really loves.
Yeah. Yeah. And his base are willing to be on board for that. Some of them relish in it and some of them kind of plug their nose and go with it because they support the policies.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see. One of the questions I've been hearing a lot of people talking about are some of these allegations that, the timing of announcing his cancer diagnosis is dubious. He's trying to distract away from the release of her recordings and the book and things like that. I think that seems highly improbable because if I were gaming this out from a messaging perspective, all it does is highlight the issues that the book and the recordings, everything is talking about, all these questions, all these concerns. It's doubling down on that. It's not helping to save him in any way. As you said, Bruce, it really is just the confluence of the cancer diagnosis confirming that no, he should not have run again, and that's what seems to be clear to me. So I'm surprised that so many people are thinking that it's a strategic choice to deflect, when to me it just seems to shine a magnifying glass on it and bring it into sharper focus.
I would also say, given Biden's personal history, he would be the last person that I would expect to be playing political games.
Yeah, right. On cancer.
Yeah, I mean,
And he lost
I-
his son. He had a brain
Yes.
aneurysm. I mean, enough already. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I can't think of any president who took the issue of cancer more seriously than Biden did. So I'm not. Yeah, I don't give any credibility to that.
Yeah. And another one of the things I'm hearing about is a lot of there's interesting discussion around, why wasn't it caught earlier? Why didn't they catch it in the screening? And I was looking into this online, and it's interesting because in a lot of the reporting, so there's a lot of the reporting is saying that they only recommend cancer screening from, I think it was, 55 to 69 or something like that in men. And some of the reporting is saying they recommend not screening past that point. The CDC website says it does not recommend regular screening. But if there's, certain risk factors or things like that, okay. But there are some risks and concerns that come with screening. So they don't really recommend regular screening, but they don't say don't screen. So I think it's interesting because, yes, Presidents Bush and Obama were both getting their screening happening for prostate cancer while they were in office. But their age window was in the range where you'd want to be getting tested and checked. Whereas if Biden's last exam was where they ran the blood work was in 2014, that's when he was last in that age window. I think he had the option of getting tested later, but the fact that he doesn't break with what the recommendation is. But it was a choice he could have made. He could have gotten screening done sooner.
Now, that a bit of trivia for our listeners. When a president undergoes a colonoscopy, that is one of the rare occasions where there actually has to be an acting president sworn in, just temporarily, because of the fact that they're under anesthetic. Yes. Yeah. So I think I don't know if Obama ever did, but George W. Bush definitely, I think, a couple of times.
Yes.
Had to have an acting president sworn in.
So what do you think, the impact of all of this will be on Biden's legacy in the end? Is, with it, interestingly, also mentioned his personal history and tie with cancer. One of the big initiatives, both when he was vice president and then as president, was his cancer moonshot. This was something he focused on and really, really wanted to make progress on. Does the cancer diagnosis or anything that's happened recently, does it change his legacy? Is that something we know, or does it pretty much stay on the same trajectory it was on?
In my mind, no, it doesn't. The cancer diagnosis doesn't change anything. His decision changed everything. And I believe that will be history's judgment on him.
Yeah, I think I agree with Bruce. Even though the immediate judgment on presidents is often shaped by things they had no control over, in the long term, I think judgments become more oriented around things that they did have control over.
Very good point. Very good.
They make. And so I agree with Bruce.
So just my last question before I get your by the number stats is do you think that all of this will help or hurt the Democrats as they try to chart a pathway forward and regain some ground in, the 2026 midterms and then look toward the 2028 presidential election? How does this play into their trying to find their footing?
I don't think it will. 3.5 years is a long time before the next election. And I think what it does put a higher degree of scrutiny and proof of life by candidates running. And so I believe the candidates that are really serious will show full medical records and everyone will see that they are fit and so forth. So I think what we're talking about today will fade dramatically by the time primaries roll around for 2028. So I'm not too worried about it at all as far as being a long time drag on the party.
I think it's really important to remember that in any country, any party that has a really difficult loss is a rabble for about a year after that. And people who are looking in despair at the Democratic Party at the moment just need to remember this is what every party looks like when they go through a tough loss. This is what the coalition looks like. Well, the former coalition Australia looks like now. This is what the Tories look like in the UK. This is what this is what Republicans looked like in immediately after Obama's victory, although they actually did manage to coalesce fairly quickly, sort of forced by their right flank. But I think that Democrats will recover from this. I don't think this makes much of a difference.
We can also look in other historical terms, in terms of eras. You had Reaganism, and now we have Trumpism. Reagan was elected in 1980. It took 12 years before the Democrats could find middle-of-the-road Democrats to seize the country back with Clinton and Gore. Well, I don't know where the 12 years begins. Is it 2016 or is it 2024? I hope it's 2016. But so we will see. We will see. But there is a recovery period. There's no question.
Okay.
Ask Peter Dutton about that, okay?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how things play out. It's going to be interesting, and I think the midterms will be telling. And I'll be curious to see what direction the Democrats go in for 2028. We certainly see a number of people starting to make some early steps in different directions to position themselves for a potential run. But that's very early days, and I think they're kind of testing the ground in different ways to see where they can get traction, particularly around a lot of the demographics where Democrats lost votes in this election. So I'd love to get your by the numbers stats. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. One of the most important bills that Biden passed was his first reconciliation bill, and it had to do a lot with investments in the country, coming out of COVID, rebuilding the country, clean energy, all kinds of things. Very important. And he had to get that through some difficult terrain, but he did. And so we're at a reconciliation bill today. And so my data point is 4.
Okay.
Trump can only afford to lose 4 members of the House and 4 members of the Senate. And if he does lose 4 members of the House, 4 members of the Senate, his reconciliation bill will fail. So let's keep an eye on that number.
Okay, excellent. His big, beautiful bill on the magic number 4.
Gorgeous.
How about you, David?
My number is 61.
Okay.
The oldest prime minister in Australia to get elected for the first time was Malcolm Turnbull at age 61.
Really? Wow.
Yes. Yeah. Compare that to the last presidential race that we saw. Compare that to the kind of average ages that we're seeing of senators, for example. Only the Vatican really rivals the US in terms of how old people are when they become leaders. And then the most recent pope at age 69, at least that's born in the second half of the 20th century.
Ooh. Okay,
wow.
so what does this mean, David, for Prime Minister Albanese and when he has to leave the field at 63?
Yeah, very, very interesting. Very interesting point. And I haven't really thought about that, Bruce.
Invite us back to talk about that, Mari, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much. Those are fascinating statistics, and I loved hearing your insights today. And just as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is host of the Asia Chessboard podcast. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our recent event on the first 100 days of the second Trump administration and recordings from our major conferences. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Bruce and David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.